Okay, looks like I'm on. This is kind of nuts. I haven't been on YouTube for like 6 months, so especially live. This is interesting. But yeah, I'll give it a couple little, maybe a minute or two to allow people to join in on the fun. And yeah, then we can get started. Yay, I'm excited. So it's day one of our storybook calendar. I'm just kind of watching the clock. I'll probably start at about 60 seconds, gives people a chance to tune in. And we can get started on our story. Hope everybody's in their cozies or got themselves a nice blanket. Tom's got his over there. Actually, it's mine. He can borrow it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. He's going to sit on the couch and listen to the story as well. So I guess let's get started. Good evening, friends and loved ones. And welcome to day one of, what was I calling it? Bedtime Stories with OurDidneeSide. The book that our advent calendar gave us today was Mickey's Christmas Carol. Oh, unfortunately, it looks like things are going to be backwards on here, but I will show the pictures in between each page. I don't think I can do teacher style where I read it like this, because really you can't see the pictures very well from back there anyway, and it's a really tiny book, so I'll probably read the page and then I'll show the pictures so you can see the artwork and everything. But yeah, let's get cozy and we'll have a listen. Mickey's Christmas Carol. It was Christmas Eve and Ebenezer Scrooge was rushing through snowy London. Scrooge didn't like Christmas and he didn't believe in helping the poor. He barged past carolers and wouldn't give a penny to anyone. Even when Scrooge's nephew Fred stopped by his office shouting, "Merry Christmas, Uncle Scrooge!" Scrooge kicked him out. So there's Fred and Scrooge, and Bob Cratchit. A while later, Scrooge's assistant, Bob Cratchit, stepped down from his stool to go home. "I suppose you'll be wanting tomorrow off," Scrooge barked. "But be here all earlier the next day." "Thank you, Mr. Scrooge," cried Bob. "And a Merry Christmas," he called as he went. "Bah! Humbug!" muttered Scrooge. Later that night, Scrooge locked up his office and went home. As he went to open the front door, Scrooge took a closer look at his front door knocker. He gasped. On the knocker was the face of his old business partner, Jacob Marley. The face began to move, then softly called, "Scrooge." Frightened, Scrooge raced inside, but soon enough, the ghost of his former partner appeared in front of him, chains circling his body. "Tonight you'll be visited by 3 spirits," boomed Marley. "Listen to them, do what they say, or your chains will be heavier than mine. Farewell, Ebenezer." Scrooge went to bed, but not long later he was awoken by a little figure with a top hat. "I am the ghost of Christmas past," he told Scrooge. "You must come with me." But Scrooge laughed. "Look how small you are. Go away." "Silence," ordered the spirit. "If men were measured by kindness, you would be smaller than a grain of sand. We are going back to a time when Christmas was not humbug." The spirit commanded Scrooge. Yes, sorry. The spirit commanded Scrooge grab hold of his coattails, and remembering Marley's terrible warning, he held on. The windows flew open, and instantly they were soaring over the rooftops and chimneys, the spirit's little umbrella keeping them aloft. Look at that little umbrella. Soon they landed outside a brightly lit house. Joyful Christmas music filled the air. Peering through the windows, Scrooge couldn't believe his eyes. "Why, it's Isabel!" he cried, suddenly remembering the girl he had once loved. But who's she dancing so merrily with? That man was you, Scrooge, replied the spirit, in the days when you too were kind and cheerful. Then the spirit whisked Scrooge away to another scene. Inside, Scrooge, of many years before, sat behind a desk covered in money. Isabel stood in front of him, tears in her eyes. Why is Isabel crying? Asked Scrooge. Then he remembered he had taken Isabel's home from her when she could not pay her bills and refused to marry her. Oh no. Poor Isabel. Suddenly, Scrooge found himself back in bed. He thought it had been a dream, but then his thoughts turned to Isabel and how his chance of happiness with her had been ruined by his love of money. Scrooge put his head down and sobbed into his pillow. Oh, no. As he cried, Scrooge felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He sat up, and beside his bed was a fierce-looking giant, feasting. I am the ghost of Christmas present, he boomed. There's no time to lose. Don't laugh at me. And with that, the spirit picked Scrooge up and put him in his pocket. He then pushed open the roof and stepped outside as though from a doll's house. Sorry, giants talk big, okay? Scrooge peeked out of the giant's pocket. I wonder where we're going, he said to himself. Pulling Scrooge from his pocket, the spirit tore a lamppost from the ground to use it as a lantern as he walked through the streets. Soon they arrived at a tiny, run-down house. What a dreadful little house, Scrooge exclaimed. Who could live in such a place? Perhaps a miserable beggar? Look closer, Scrooge, and tell me who you see, said the spirit. Scrooge pressed his face against the glass for a better look. Why, it's Bob Cratchit, my clerk, he said with surprise. Does he live here? The spirit scowled. Look at how he lives, thanks to your generosity. Look at the food his family must eat on Christmas Eve, because it's all they can afford. The hungry Cratchit family sat at their table, about to carve up the smallest goose Scrooge had ever seen. Scrooge watched a boy named Tiny Tim hobble into the room, leaning on a little crutch. He gave thanks to Scrooge for the meal, and Scrooge felt ashamed. Tell me, spirit, what's wrong with that kind lad? Asked Scrooge. Much, I'm afraid, the spirit replied. If these shadows remain unchanged, I see an empty chair where Tiny Tim once sat. Suddenly the scene went dark, and Scrooge was alone. Church bells tolling in the distance. Just then, swirling smoke engulfed Scrooge, growing thicker and thicker, until he couldn't see anything around him. The smoke blew into his nose, and he coughed. As the smoke lifted, Scrooge found himself standing in a graveyard where there were tombstones everywhere, covered by snow. Scrooge looked up to find he was no longer alone. A horrible shadow, his face hidden inside a cloak, stood silently before him. Are you the ghost of Christmas future? Stammered Scrooge. Tell me, what will happen to Tiny Tim? The spirit just looked at Scrooge, then raised his arm to point to something in the distance. Scrooge looked to where the spirit was pointing and saw Bob Cratchit and his family gathered around a tombstone. Bob knelt before the little gravestone, tears rolling down his face, and gently laid Tiny Tim's crutch on top. Oh no, Scrooge cried. Spirit, I didn't want this to happen. Tell me these events can yet be changed. Scrooge noticed two gravediggers finishing a fresh grave. I've never seen a funeral like this, one of them said. No mourners, no friends to bid him farewell. Scrooge peered into the grave and asked the spirit who it belonged to. Why, it's yours, Ebenezer, the spirit laughed as his hood fell from his face. No, I'll change, cried Scrooge. The grave burst into flames, and the spirit pushed him in. Let me out, screamed Scrooge. Let me... Suddenly a bell tolled, and as Scrooge opened his eyes, he cried with joy. He was back in his bedroom. It's Christmas morning, he exclaimed. He threw on his coat and hat and raced for the door. He ran out onto the street calling Merry Christmas to everyone he met. He gave two men a bag of coins each, who stood there speechless, wondering what had changed in grumpy old Scrooge. Scrooge even stopped his nephew when he saw him approaching in a wagon. Fred was so surprised by his uncle's cheerfulness that he almost fell off his carriage. Waving goodbye to his nephew, Scrooge continued on his way to Bob Cratchit's house. Rat-tat! Scrooge knocked on his employee's door. Bob opened the door, and his face fell when he saw who it was. Why, Mr. Scrooge, Merry Christmas. Won't you come in? He said. Scrooge stomped inside and dropped a heavy sack on the floor. Scrooge then broke into a massive smile and told Bob that he was getting a pay rise and that he brought food and toys for his family. Bob Cratchit couldn't believe it. Oh, thank you, Mr. Scrooge. Merry Christmas, Bob, Scrooge said, as the whole family danced with joy. It was a Christmas miracle. And God bless us, every one, said Tiny Tim. So that was Mickey's Christmas Carol. I should show you the last picture, shouldn't I? It's a happy ending for everybody. So, thanks, everybody, for joining in. That was really fun for the first installment of Disney Storytime. I just wanted to wish you guys a Merry Christmas and a magical holiday season as we kick things off. Also, there's a possibility that Dylan and Roxy are watching. I know they have birthdays today, so if you're watching, happy birthday, guys. And yeah. I'm just going to kind of breeze through the chat and sort of catch up with you guys before I sign off. But I know I've got cousins watching, so hello, family. And Catherine, yes, anybody young at heart can join. My mom and dad and my dog are watching. Dory, I watch this movie every year too. I watched this probably last week. But thank you everybody for watching. I'm going to wrap the stream up here, but tune in tomorrow. I will try to share the next story in the morning because I like to open it up in the morning. Oh, and here's Carrie. Hi, Carrie. All right, I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a good one.